You've got a great product, a solid funnel, plenty of traffic to your website, but the messaging still isn't landing. That's not a copy problem, that is a clarity problem, my friend. In this video, I'll show you how to craft messaging based on what your customers actually care about, using their words, not just your assumptions. We'll dig into voice of the customer data, map messaging to the buyer journey, and build copy that drives action, not confusion. What if I told you that you could have a $2 billion payout from nailing these 3 things in your messaging? That's exactly what we're going to lean into here, is why most messaging misses the mark. So most messaging relies on generic benefits. So think about specific functionality or specific features that they want you to be excited about as a customer because they're excited that they built it, instead of using actual customer language about what it is that resonates with them. What is the problem that they're trying to solve? That is where most messaging just falls apart. The other thing that makes messaging miss the mark is relying too heavily on what you think your customers want versus actually tapping into the emotions and motivations that your customers have during the purchase journey. You have executives sitting on the 15th floor and legal teams that are making decisions about the copy, but when was the last time that they actually sat in a room with your customers? Brand marketers end up with bland messaging that is somewhat removed from the language that their customers are actually using, just because there's that distance between decision makers and your actual customers. So I want to use an example. There was a brand that debuted on Shark Tank in 2018, if memory serves, and they were called Mother Beverage. And they got a fair investment of $400,000. That's not bad, right? But fast forward a few years, and they were making $2 billion from being bought out by PepsiCo. So we're gonna dig into what were the things that they did in their messaging and their marketing to transform from $400,000 Mother Beverage to $2 billion Poppy. For brands needing to nail their messaging and demonstrate return on investment, this is the first thing you need to do. Dig into your voice of the customer data. You know, those sales calls that you've recorded, any sort of customer feedback or support tickets, or even better yet, surveys and interviews that you've conducted. Get really familiar with what your customers have already told you. And then you're going to do this. So what are your customers already telling you? But here are 3 non-traditional ways that you can learn more from your customers and the culture that they find themselves in. First thing is called immersions. So that is having unfiltered interactions with your customers, going and experience what their day-to-day life looks like. That's very similar to the second approach, which is called ethnography. So with ethnographies, you are really just observing and watching their natural behaviors. So for example, you have them do a video diary of their daily interactions with your products. I just did a study where I asked people who use products like Poppy to go film themselves buying the product and do a bit of narration about what is the things that they're looking for, what are the things at retail that they notice. And I'm also listening for what are the things that they don't notice, that they don't speak about when they're making that purchase decision. So really valuable insights from ethnographies. And the third non-traditional way to hear more from your customers is doing customer-led creation labs. So that is putting your customers in the hot seat of product design. And you will have your customers side by side with the engineers creating something. That is really powerful way to hear how your customers think, How are they making decisions and what trade-offs are they making in real time to inform your product development as well as your messaging? So our example, going back to Poppy's strategy, they leaned into their voice of customer data by looking at purchase patterns, customer feedback, and customer engagement to continuously nail their messaging. It's not a one and done process. You need to continually look at your voice of the customer data so that you can be ahead of any shifts in that. So a thing to think about when you are crafting messaging that just needs to land the first time is what phrases are your customers using when they're describing their pain, their frustrations. They're probably not speaking about your product specifically. So think about, what are the things that they say? What are the ways that they think? And what are the emotions that they feel? The biggest trap that I see clients fall into when they're thinking about crafting their messaging is thinking that one message will serve the purpose for all of their marketing touch points. And that's not true. In fact, from awareness to advocacy, all the way through that funnel, each stage requires different language because the customer has different questions, has a different mindset from the time that they're first aware of your brand to the time when they're ready to purchase and ready to recommend it to someone else. So I'm gonna give you an example. In the awareness phase, customers don't even know that they have a problem. They are seeing symptoms and they're maybe talking about their pains and frustrations, but they haven't really realized that there's a solution yet. And so in that awareness phase, you want to be talking about those symptoms and you want to be sort of turning the knob up to create a sense of urgency to find a solution. And maybe you start hinting that there's a solution out there in the awareness phase versus the phase where they have come to make a decision. They've chosen you versus your competitors. And in that case, they want to feel successful fast. They want to see quick wins. And so your communication in the decision phase is going to show how they're making progress. It's going to call out those early wins so that your customers get a sense of reward and accomplishment instead of buyer's remorse. So you can see how messaging is not a one size fits all thing. It needs to account for the language your customers are using, the emotions and mindsets that are at play at each phase of that journey. So let's think about what Poppy did. They were leaning into collaborations and influencers to help drive their brand awareness. So their messaging in that awareness phase was carrying a tone that focused on the consumer concerns about digestive health and overall wellness. They were not leaning into messaging specific about what that solution was. They were communicating and resonating with their audience's pain points at the awareness phase. Hey, if this is giving you new ways to think about messaging, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I break down strategies like this regularly to help teams build sharper funnels, clearer positioning, and content that actually converts. So go ahead and subscribe and stay sharp. I don't know why more people aren't talking about this. Maybe they just don't know about it, but there is a system that consistently translates the insights you get from voice of customer data into messaging that resonates with your audience. It's called the AIM framework. And it's one of the things that I use to make sure that my messaging is going to resonate with my audience. So let me give you an example. The one-line proposition statement. It is, we help audience do this job with this goal. So a perfect example of this is Poppy. So when they first started in 2018, they were leaning really heavily into the features of that product. I see a lot of businesses do this, leaning really heavily into technical side. So you can see on their packaging, they said this is apple cider vinegar. Now, let's get real. How many customers wake up in the morning and they say, you know what I need that will really set my day off right? Apple cider vinegar. Not many people, and even fewer people back in 2018. So you can see how that messaging just didn't appeal to very many people. So fast forward to what they did was they leaned into more customer friendly language and more emotive language, like it's time to love soda again, or it is for a healthy gut. That is something that a customer is likely to say. You know what? I don't know exactly what I need, but it's time for me to find something that gives me a healthy gut. That's customer friendly language. And so you can see how that pivot was part of their success. So really, you want to move from the raw customer language to structured headlines, benefits, call to actions that uses your customer's language as closely as you can get. You also want to focus on the emotional clarity and simplicity. This is not the time to use jargon. It is not the time to get cutesy with your language. You want to be clear and simple. The less you can make your customers think, the better, which sounds terrible. But let's be honest, we all have 1.5 million things running in our mind. So the clearer you can be with your messaging, the better it will work out for you in terms of sales. And so another thing that I want to stress when you are moving from insights to that messaging is to have a discussion. Do this exercise with all of the decision makers in the room. That will speed the time to decisions and make sure that your messaging is consistent across all touch points. If your brand messaging is fun and energetic on social, but serious and conservative in email, that's going to be a disconnect for your customers. And even though they may not be able to articulate that, it's going to hurt your sales because being inconsistent in your messaging is a signal that you don't really know what your brand identity is. And if you don't know, why should your customer believe you, right? So you want to have all of the decision makers in the room when you are crafting this messaging so that you have alignment from day one. So another good question to ask when you are moving from insights to your messaging is, how do you make that messaging resonate without losing your brand tone of voice, without losing your point of differentiation as a brand? Pepsi, Dove, Bud Light, they all failed to remember this one thing, and their sales tanked as a result of it. The thing was, they failed to remember that customers exist in the real world, navigating cultural shifts, cultural events that not just happen externally, but that become deep-rooted parts of their lives and sometimes their identity. So failing to remember that your customers exist in the world is a surefire way to make sure your messaging isn't gonna land. So the best way to avoid this is if you're going to touch on something that is emotionally charged, make sure your customers are in the room, whether it's through a co-creation session or you're doing interviews before you finalize that messaging. Make sure your customers have a say-so. That is your opportunity to check for gaps between your internal language, what you think is going to resonate, and customer understanding. Having them in the room to co-create, whether it's your current customers or prospects, helps you to fill in the gaps. They may have a different interpretation of the language, the messaging that you're trying to convey, or the visuals that you're trying to use that you want to hear before you've invested millions behind this campaign. And again, I cannot stress it enough. Whenever possible, use your customer's exact language. So are you using language that feels relevant to your audience in terms of their day-to-day experience and their culture? Let me know. Don't write another line of copy until you hear this. You need a repeatable system to ensure that your messaging resonates with your customers every single time. Again, the one that I use is called the AIM framework, and it starts by setting up a centralized repository for voice of the customer data. Because listen, if your insights are stuck in a deck somewhere sitting on someone's computer and the entire business doesn't have access to it, you are cheating yourselves from the impact that those insights could have. So really, it starts with making sure the entire business has access to these insights and it's not just trapped in a deck somewhere. And then the next thing you want to do is have regular dialogue about shifts that you see in those insights. Customers are constantly evolving and their value systems probably stay the same, but how those values are expressed varies. Let me just give a quick example. So, for example, people who value fairness likely believe that people should be treated fair, and that's something that is cemented in them probably before they go off to school. But what fairness looks like can change as they grow up. For example, I see a lot of people who are under 35 believing that fairness looks like everyone having equal access to the same resources. But flip the switch, and once those same customers are over 45, then fairness looks like everyone carrying their own weight. And so while the value of fairness is cemented early on, how that shows up over your customers' life stages can vary. And so you want to have conversations like this throughout your organizations. Anyone who's contributing to your messaging or making decisions that impact your customer should have access to that data and have regular conversations about what's going on with your customers. Then take it a step further and generate ideas on how you could address those shifts in a way that's meaningful for your business. And then you are going to prioritize the ideas. I like to prioritize them based off of two things. The first thing being impact to the business, so the commercial aspect. And then the second thing I like to prioritize them on is how feasible it will be for the business. So those are really the two dimensions that I prioritize new ideas on. And then the ideas that make it through the prioritization need to be translated into reusable messaging blocks for different channels and different stages in the marketing funnel. And again, get all the decision makers involved. So you want to make sure all of the decision makers have a say-so, have a voice to make sure that your brand messaging is consistent across all of your touch points. Do this every single time you have a messaging refresh. And by doing this repeatable system, it becomes easier and you can move faster the next time. So curious, how often are you guys refreshing your messaging using new shifts in customer behavior? Is it once a year, twice a year? Let me know. Okay, so now you know how to create messaging that actually works based off of your customers' real values, not just what you think they should care about. So if you're serious about dialing your messaging in, YouTube already knows what video you should watch next. It's now on the screen somewhere. So click it and let's keep improving your message market fit.